Hello, everyone. Dr. Stillman here today with Jim Laird. We are going to be talking about protein, which we love talking about, largely because when we talk about protein, we get people to make better choices with their protein, and then they feel better, and then lots of their problems go away. But the thing about that is that I had a conversation, or I had a talk yesterday with the Weston A. Price Foundation down in Naples, Florida. And I said what my recommendations for protein were. And one of the people who was there said that she disagreed with me. And she didn't really give me a clear answer as to what she thought differently than me. But, and I did mention this in the talk. There's a lot more to how much protein you should eat than just you're this tall or you weigh this much. This is how much protein you should eat. A lot of it has to do with what your goals are, what illnesses you may be struggling with. And this is why, Jim and I, when we talk about things, it's very rare that we vilify something. I can't even think of something that I would really want to, dunk on other than processed foods and things that are obviously bad, because everything is just a strategy. Eating a certain amount of protein is a strategy. Restricting protein, restricting calories, it's a strategy. What are you trying to do? And one of the things that we'll do in cases is when someone is struggling with something and they come to us and they say, look, what should I be eating? We'll generally speaking, try to get them to eat more protein because we see it helping a lot of people. But the other thing you'll see is that people will sometimes do much, much better when they fast and calorie restrict and eat a lower protein diet. And if they come to us and they say, look, I'd really like to try fasting, I'd really like to try a low protein, low calorie diet, there are situations in which we think that's appropriate. And I've seen it really work for people. But you have to be very careful with things like fasting and protein restriction because they can really, really mess people up. And this is a place where a lot of people go off the rails. So, Jim, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is a really and if that nice little noise in the background is my dog chewing on his dog toy. So
look, is that coming through the mic?
Yeah,
oh,
that's
man,
all right. He's done chewing it now. So good old Rommel. But this is really confusing. If you dive into like traditional cultures, that's why human diet in general is so confusing, because all these cultures basically ate foods that were in their environment, right? And we've created this kind of artificial environment where we can have any foods year round at any time. Now, it gets kind of sticky because you've got people that say, don't eat animal protein because it's bad for you. It's going to cause cancer. Then you've got, other people that are saying, if you get enough sunlight, it doesn't matter what you eat. And just have observation for the last almost 30 years of doing this. And in our culture, most people want to look athletic. They don't want to look like a frail, tiny person. And a lot of these cultures where they don't eat a lot of food, or they're not getting a lot of animal products in their diet, they're really, really tiny people. Like tiny. Like if you've ever been in Nepal, they are little tiny people. I don't want to be a little tiny person. So that's
Jim, you couldn't be a little tiny person if you tried.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah, my grandfather was built just like I am, but 5'6". So luckily I got up to 5'10". So this is where it gets very, very confusing. But I will see the three things recently that really make the difference for people is when people start eating more protein, they do better, they feel better, they have more muscle, their hair, nails, everything looks better. And there are cases where protein might be detrimental, like you stated. The other thing is managing insulin, whether that's through diet, combination of sun exposure, getting outside more is going to help control your insulin. If you control insulin and you eat enough protein, you're going to look better and you're going to feel better than the vast majority of the population.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mentioned actually exactly what you mentioned about protein in the talk. I said, look, I might say that I want most of my patients to be eating, and my rule is 2 grams per inch of height. And that's a lot for a lot of people. They don't realize how much less than that they're consuming. And that's what I said in the talk. It's what I generally tell patients when they ask me that question point blank. But I like to get to know them to understand where they are.
Right.
Because there's times when they need to do something else if they're going to be able to consume and accommodate that level of protein intake. And there's caveats to whether or not you need that load, right? And, cancer is a good example of this that came up recently in an Instagram comment that I posted. Somebody talked about how dairy consumption was linked to higher levels of IGF-1. So IGF-1, for those of you who don't know, it's called insulin-related growth factor 1. And it's a really amazing marker for growth hormone production. The higher your IGF-1 level, the higher your growth hormone level. And growth hormone is very strongly correlated with the quality of your skin, your hair, your nails, your muscle mass, your body composition, your overall metabolic health. Growth hormone is something that, anecdotally, I've seen or heard of patients getting up out of their wheelchairs after using. And there was a scare back, and I think it was the 80s, where they said, human growth hormone being derived from, I can't remember what animal's pituitary gland or how it was being synthesized or produced. But they said, look, this is contaminated. We don't want it to cause things like prion diseases. So use of growth hormone really dropped off. But lots of things you can do in your diet and lifestyle will affect IGF-1 levels. Many of the experts in the cancer world look at IGF-1 and say, we want to minimize this because it will minimize long-term our risk of cancer. And I, wouldn't disagree with the premise that calorie restriction, including protein restriction, will maintain a low to low normal IGF-1 level. And it, I think, likely reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer. But you wind up a little old person who is not physically impressive. And for a lot of our patients, their goal is not to look little and dotter into their old age. It's to be physical and impressive and, be able to enjoy life. And all that comes with having higher muscle mass, higher libido, better looking skin, hair, nails, whatever. And so those are really important factors to consider when you're in the case. And I'll be frank with patients about this, because let's say somebody comes to me, and this is where getting into the family history, I think, is relevant. Because if somebody comes to me and they say, look, everyone in my family dies of cancer, I want to do everything that I can to reduce my risk of cancer, or maybe they've had cancer already and they're terrified of having a recurrence. Well, I'm going to counsel them about this association with IGF-1 and increased rates of or increased risk for cancer, because I don't want them to wind up. I want them to be aware of it. And I don't think it's as simple as saying the higher your IGF-1 level or the higher your protein intake, the higher your risk of cancer. But that certainly is suggested by the literature. And I haven't done a ton of study on this, but I don't think that what I've just said is a very controversial opinion. But this is why we also get into other things way beyond protein in counseling patients and helping people to be healthy, because it's so much of what happens with the protein that you're taking in depends upon other factors in your diet and lifestyle. A much greater risk factor for cancer than your protein load is artificial light at night and lack of sunlight during the day.
Yeah,
And
broken circadian rhythm, I'd say, would be a big one.
right. Not to mention things like processed foods and lack of certain minerals and vitamins and things like that. But it's really, and the other place where fasting, I think, becomes very, very helpful. And this is so interesting with metabolically, but there's some people with autoimmune and allergic diseases who I've spoken to who were able to resolve their symptoms when they underwent a very aggressive fast. We're talking days or even weeks. But the consequence of that, of course, is massive loss of muscle mass and likely bone mass in a lot of these cases, which is something that many people can't withstand. It's not safe for them. So you have to be asking questions, not just of what's the therapeutic goal, but where's the patient's, say, BMI? I would not want to take a patient with a BMI of 19 down to 18 or 17 because they were concerned and wanted to try and fast in order to get rid of their insert autoimmune disease here. Because I think that would be, it would be reckless. And I also think that coming back from that BMI can be very challenging. And if someone's living in the 18, 19, 20, 21 range for BMI, one of my top priorities with their case is actually to get that number up, because while you don't necessarily want an excess amount of lean muscle mass, things like weight training every week will reduce your overall risk of death. And that's largely because, I believe it's because of its impact on mitochondrial density, but that will, of course, then trigger more lean muscle mass.
Well, and things like falling and things like that as well.
So,
these things are all tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is somebody robust enough to handle that tool, right? I was talking to a lady here recently who had just had, she'd had a large number of children, and she had just had her last child, and she was still breastfeeding this child, and decided that she was going to go on like a 6-day fast. It did not end well for her. Like, I would not recommend doing a 6-day fast.
Exactly.
When you're breastfeeding a child. Like, there has to be some context here. Like, most of the people that we've seen and I've seen over the years, they have an autoimmune disease. They simplify their diet. They eat real wholesome food. They work on their sleep. They get outside, and they're able to manage it pretty effectively. So, I used a very long fast to beat one of my infections that I had years ago. But I was also running out of antibiotic options, and I was running out of options of things to do. So,
and you were how many pounds?
That was 255 pounds, right? So I did like a 10-day water fast, right?
And how much weight did you drop?
Not much.
Right.
I didn't really lose that much weight. I probably lost about 10 pounds. That was it.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
I probably only lost about 10 pounds.
There's people who would mortgage their houses in order to lose 10 pounds. I didn't lose much weight.
No, I didn't.
In relative terms, right? So, if Jim's 250, he loses 10 pounds. What is that?
That's
it's like less than 10% of your body fat, right? Or body weight, I should say.
Right. Yeah. And so it's
women out there who are just like, oh my gosh, I hate you.
Well, people there was a time about 2 years ago, I kind of let myself go a little bit. I had a lot going on, and I wasn't training as consistently, and I was it was right around the beer bug stuff. I, had some bad habits creep into my life, and I'd gained a little bit of weight, and I started training again. And literally in a month, I went from, and I didn't look terrible. I went from, in a month, I went from being a little bit chunky for me to being pretty ripped. And these women are just like, how can you do that so fast? And I'm like, well, I have a lot of muscle mass. So if I clean my diet up a little bit and I do a little bit of walking and I lift some weights, I get really lean really fast. It's just part of the deal, right? So, and the other one of the reasons why I encourage people to, if they are going to eat, carbohydrates, eat them with a protein so you don't spike insulin so much, and then also eat them after you train. That way, you get the positive side effects of added muscle mass.
Right.
There are positive things to insulin.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone in this business or fitness wants to demonize everything. Like, there's a time and place for just about everything. It's just a matter, and most people don't have the basics down. They don't sleep well. They don't get outside. They're not eating whole foods. So you got to start there, and then you can kind of tweak and alter and do whatever you need to do. But most people don't even start with a foundation. You really can't worry about what color your walls are or what kind of tiles you're going to put on the roof until you actually build the house.
Amen. Yeah, and what you said there ties back into the IGF1 protein. And I'm going to talk for a minute about labs that I check and look at when I'm thinking about protein load in patients. So IGF1 level I've already mentioned, and it ties back into something Jim just mentioned about insulin. So IGF1 is our main marker for growth hormone, but it's also, the name, as I mentioned before, is insulin-related growth factor 1. It's related to insulin. And this is a clue that you actually need carbohydrates in order to support normal levels of growth hormone. Because you have to understand what the body is trying to orchestrate with hormones, okay? Not just one, not just another, all of them together. And you've got to understand that in the context of your goals. So if you come, and I've seen this has actually happened in the practice. If you come to a guy like Jim and you say, look, I want to be lean and have a tight body with low muscle mass, but I want to be fertile.
You mean low fat mass?
What did I say?
You said low muscle mass.
Oh, my bad. Low body fat.
Right. You want to be like abs as a female.
Yeah. And you want to be fertile. Well, that's not necessarily compatible goals. You need a certain amount of body fat in order to have those kiddos. And one of the ways that women will wreck their hormones, we've seen this over and over again, is excessive calorie restriction, excessive protein restriction for prolonged periods of time. Jim talks about this all the time.
With excessive exercise.
Yeah, and the excessive exercise is like the gasoline on that fire. So, that trio just wrecks hormone panels. And so you need to understand that, when you want to, say, gain muscle mass, right? Well, that means you need to grow something. So you need growth hormone levels to be adequate, if not elevated. You need insulin to trigger that growth. And so insulin's related to growth hormone because it's also an anabolic hormone. And that's why people will get so frustrated, because they don't understand why they're on a ketogenic diet and eating enough protein and hitting the gym and taking creatine and using pre-workout and all these things that are supposed to cause them to gain muscle mass, and yet they're tired all the time and they're not functioning well and they're not gaining muscle mass. It may be a lack of carbohydrates, because that's a really key trigger for growth. And this intimidates a lot of people who they want to lose weight and they're afraid of carbohydrates, because that's the meme out there in the world of metabolic health, that you have to restrict carbohydrates, or the best way to lose weight is to restrict carbohydrates. But sometimes it's part of the solution long-term for not just short-term weight loss, but actually long-term weight loss, because it helps you gain muscle that, as Jim mentioned, helps you to keep your metabolic engine high or big so you can burn more calories.
Well, and from a sustainability point too, right. I always tell people you want to earn your carbs, so eat your carbs after you train. Like that's always the best. Yes. The majority of your carbs anyways, because you're going to get insulin response, but your muscles are going to soak up that glycogen even more efficiently than when they're not, right? Because lifting weights improves insulin sensitivity. I mean, I think everyone can agree you don't want to be blasting insulin all the time.
No,
it's the most anabolic hormone in the body. Bodybuilders have understood this for a long time. That's why they take insulin after they train. So and then super low in carbohydrates. But there's obviously no need for that, and that's very dangerous, and you could kill yourself very quickly doing it. And that's why most bodybuilders at the pro level don't really have a good life expectancy, because they do really crazy, insane things, right? And it also gives, a lot of the bad juju around growth hormone, or whether it's testosterone or testosterone replacement, comes from people using super, super, super physiological doses. When you're taking 10 to 15 IUs of growth hormone a day versus 1 IU a day, there is a very, very, very large difference there, right?
Right. So I want to add a couple more things, and then we'll get to some questions in the comments. There's a couple more labs that I look at for protein load. One of them is uric acid. This gets it has gotten a lot of press in the last couple of years. But the real key to understanding uric acid, in my opinion, is understanding that it is a marker for your purine load in your diet, as well as your elimination of those purines. And so I want to see, when I see a low uric acid level, I'm confident that person is not eating a high load of protein, particularly animal protein that's rich in purines, or seafood and fish and shellfish. I don't want the uric acid level to be too high. But many people will benefit from having it in the 5 to 6 or even 7 range for muscle mass growth and hypertrophy, if that's their goal. And this is where people will get freaked out about uric acid levels and think, oh no, it's high, I'm metabolically unhealthy, I need to worry about this. No. You don't necessarily need to worry about that. When it does get excessively elevated, we can see the disease of gout manifest. But what you'll find is that the people who are having gout attacks, what matters far more than their uric acid level are they drinking, particularly beer and wine? Are they under consuming vegetables? Are they over consuming rich fatty foods and under consuming key minerals like potassium, magnesium, to a certain extent calcium? Because these elements, as well as trace elements, help the body handle protein and utilize it. And this is where, even if you're eating a high protein load, you're not going to do good things with that protein if you have micronutrient problems. And this is where the conversation about protein and cancer becomes very interesting, because when cancers arise because of metabolic dysfunction within the cell and within the mitochondria. And we may surmise that if you keep the mitochondria healthy and properly nourished, they won't turn cancerous. And so it's okay to eat a high protein load so long as your mitochondria are doing well. And that the real problem comes when you push protein into a system where mitochondria are sick, and you give cancers or cancer cells the fuel in order to proliferate and then metastasize. And then on top of that, when you're in a nutrient deficient state and you restrict that protein and other carbohydrates and fats, so you're caloric restricted, right? You're going to trigger autophagy, and the body's going to naturally try and fix those broken mitochondria and eliminate those cells. And that's big part, I believe, of why the calorie restriction, protein restriction paradigm is associated with lower rates of cancer. But I think that micronutrient piece is really key, because it doesn't mean that we all have to eat a low protein diet. I mean, Lord knows we need people out there who are capable of generating some real serious physical, power. You need people like soldiers, firemen, sailors, heavy, people doing manual labor. You can't tell those people to eat a low protein diet and be, unmuscular, weak men.
If you look at what they used to feed the pilots on the SR-71, these guys that would have to do 9, 10, 12-hour flights, right?
Really?
Steak and eggs was there.
How do you know this?
It's in this book about the Blackbird.
No kidding.
They thought that was astronauts too, and they would go before they'd go up in space. They knew they weren't going to be eating for a long period of time. They would eat steak and eggs. That was what for mental acuity, for focus. They wouldn't want to spike blood sugar, but they would want enough protein and all sorts of things like that. Let's go back to when you're dealing with clients who have a history of, their parents or relatives being sick. I think it's very important to kind of mentally coach these people, and I've done this for years. You're going to make choices, and you're going to change your environment so that you're not this. Just because your parents had this disease doesn't mean you're destined to it. I think there's a lot of fear mongering in the medical establishment. I think a lot of that's done on purpose so that you can get people to take certain drugs. Well, I need to take this drug because my parents had this or they had that. You don't want to hyper focus on that, because you're gonna self-fulfilling prophecy type stuff. So you need to focus on, I am going to do things that are going to increase my odds of a better outcome, and I'm going to change the environment. I'm not going to do the same habits and eat the same things that my parents did. I'm going to spend more time outside. I'm going to do all these things, because people will get hyper focused on a disease and then they end up with the disease.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple more things I want to add about the labs. Another thing I'll look at when I'm thinking about protein load, as well as other ways to nourish the patient, are things like zinc and copper levels, magnesium levels, and then glucose levels. Glucose measured either with a fasting glucose or with A1C. That's what I typically use in my practice. We check those routinely within our annual plans. And there's a lot of other markers that I could talk about, particularly hormones for protein load. But when you see someone who's got a high glucose, insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, if they've got low zinc levels, if they've got low or elevated copper levels, changing the composition of their diet. And if they've got low zinc and high copper, particularly pushing the high zinc foods like red meats, you will see life-changing improvements in their metabolic health. This is a big part of why keto carnivore really changes people's lives and helps them to resolve their obesity, resolve their diabetes. But again, it's not a be-all, end-all. And we get a lot of people who come to us for help after they've already tried the low-hanging fruit of basically carbohydrate restriction, wondering what am I doing wrong in my diet and how can I improve it? But rarely do I find someone who's got markers for insulin resistance and particularly a low zinc status who doesn't feel better. I mean, I can't think of a case off the top of my head who doesn't feel better when they eat more red meat, because it helps them improve their muscle function. And this then leads to better metabolic health in general.
So we've got a question on collagen protein powder.
So Matthias asks, is collagen powder a good supplement if you cannot get bone broth every day? My answer would be yes. The things I want people to know about collagen powders and peptides are that you actually, I would read the label and I would try to figure out what exactly is in that, in the product. And here's why. Whenever you take a specific ingredient or set of ingredients like collagen out of a food, you're losing other elements. So one thing that many people don't realize is that bones and bone broth, when you make them yourself or when they're store-bought and made from real bones, they're not only high in collagen, they're high in silica. And silica is part of your collagen network. That's one reason why silica is in practically every single skin, hair, and nails supplement that's sold primarily to women for better skin, hair, and nails. And so that's really an important element for you to be getting enough of, and I'll often give it to people. It's also effective for helping people eliminate aluminum from the body because of its molecular structure. And so that's one reason why I prefer bone broth over collagen peptides. And I say that because I don't want you to think that they're the same food. There may be other elements that I'm not aware of, minerals, vitamins, things like that. But in general, the answer is yes. It's a good option if you can't get bone broth every day.
Have you seen people get tired when they start eating more protein and putting on muscle? I know teenagers need more sleep because they're growing so much. Does this also translate to adults? Yes, it can, depending how hard your training load is. And anytime you make an adjustment, like say you've been eating 30 grams of protein a day and you bump it up to 80, 90, 100, there might be a period of time where your body has to get used to that, and you might feel a little off because your system is like, whoa, where's all this extra protein coming from? And if you are training hard enough to add muscle mass and you're adding muscle mass, yes, that's going to increase your need for rest. So hopefully that answers your question.
I think that's pretty clear. And yeah, I agree with everything Jim just said. Jim, any other last thoughts on protein and protein loads?
Your body is an amazing, incredibly complex machine that can survive all sorts of shenanigans. If you look at history, some of the stuff people have survived is insane, absolutely insane.
Right.
If you give it what it needs, sunlight, fresh air, real food, it can figure out a lot of this stuff on its own. I think because we live in a society where everything is available to us and we have so many choices, it's really easy to get confused and distracted by all sorts of shiny objects. So do the best you can, eat real food, move your body, keep it simple, and try not to get too distracted. And then if you run into a situation where you need to try some different things, make sure you've got all the basics down first before you start doing any kind of extreme measures.
Absolutely. I agree. So thanks everyone for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter. We've got exciting things, events, podcasts, lives, etc. coming up. Jim, you want to plug the testosterone webinar we recorded?
Yeah, we did it. We actually did a 2-hour testosterone webinar.
We did.
On, was it Saturday?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll put a link to that in the description. Our testosterone course is for sale. It's open to the end of the month. If you're in Florida, Virginia, or New York, we also have a medical offer that goes to that.
Or if you're willing to fly to see me, we can
Right.
take care of you at our practice and check a really, really amazing panel of labs to figure out what's going on with your testosterone.
There'll be links to all of that in the description/comments.
That's right.
Thanks for tuning in.
Take care, everyone. Have a great day.